Hey everyone, welcome back to the Azure podcast. This is episode 439. We've got myself, Kendall, we got Sujit, and we have a very special guest today, Tom Kerkhove, who you've probably heard from before. He's been on the show. He's also really involved in KEDA, or the Kubernetes Event-Driven Autoscaler project. But in addition, he's also an engineer over on the Azure API management team. And today we're going to talk with him about the self-hosted gateway v2. So Tom, just want to say thanks so much for joining us today. Before we dive in, we're going to cover a couple of Azure updates. So I'm going to pass it over to Sujit to kick us off.
Thanks, Kendall. All right, so we've got three of them today. The first one is the resizing of the paired virtual networks is now possible. It used to be a pain in the neck if you had paired two virtual networks and you change the size. You had to break the pair, change the size, and reattach and whatnot. Now this feature is allows you to do it without with less of a hassle. Another update of this one is with AKS and the integration between AKS and the API server, which can be routed through through the VNet that AKS is currently configured. So, if AKS is attached to a VNet, your API server endpoint, the endpoint that kubectl would talk to typically, can also be kind of connected to that same VNet now, and this makes it a little more easier to secure your API server endpoint. And I believe that is in preview. And the third one, which was my favorite kind of release news of all, is the public preview of Operation Abort. And what this is Operation Abort allows operations in AKS that are done on the cluster or the agent pool to be aborted in the middle. Just say you issue a command and like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. You can actually, abort that operation now. This might leave the cluster in an unusable state, so you have to kind of use it only as a last resort. But that feature is now available. I do like the name though. It has. Kendall, what do you have?
Yeah, so I wanted to cover just a couple of event-related updates. So one of the things that I've been working on, and I've written a couple of blog posts for it actually, is serverless September. So if you haven't if you haven't been keeping a pulse on this already, essentially it's a collection of blog posts. So we have blog posts going out every single day of September, all related to different Azure technologies, in the serverless space. And then in addition, there's Ask the Expert sessions. So I know we have one coming up for container apps, but there's also been some for Azure Functions. So definitely recommend checking that out. I'll make sure I drop the link for all of that syndicated in the show notes. And then in addition, if you didn't already have it on your calendar, make sure that you mark Ignite coming up October 12th to the 14th. So I'm sure we'll reiterate this in coming episodes, but definitely good to get that on your calendar early because it's a lot of product-centric updates, which I think we love here on the Azure podcast, and hopefully all of you do as well. So that's what I had. Hey Tom, why don't you introduce yourself? Just for anybody who may not have heard your previous episodes.
So thank you very much for having me. My name is indeed Tom Kerkhove, and I'm a senior software engineer on API management, most specifically on the self-hosted and the managed gateway in the cloud. And next to that, I also co-maintain KEDA indeed, for which we now also have a AKS add-on in preview if people are interested.
And I believe, Tom, the last time you came on, you actually weren't working for Microsoft yet, right? I think that has changed since the last time we had you on. Now
yes, that's correct. So, I joined November last year, so that's almost 1 year coming up. So time flies. It's crazy. Thank you.
So tell us about this new feature in APIM, and let's just start with just giving everyone kind of an overview of, just to remind our listeners, is what is APIM, what kind of what use case does it help solve?
Yeah, so Azure API Management is a API management solution that allows you to have a central place to expose all your APIs, be it SOAP, REST, or GraphQL, and have like this company-wide effort to manage these things. We have dev portals that help you versioning, a lot of policies that help you simplify things and really put the logic on the gateway instead of your code. But all of this was in Azure, which is fine. But in a lot of scenarios, you also want to take that same gateway and run it outside of Azure. And very common scenarios I see is multi-cloud and hybrid, where maybe you're still running on-prem and you need to expose those APIs on-prem and want to use the same way of governing, exposing them, securing these APIs. Same thing for multi-cloud is maybe you have workloads on different clouds, including Azure, and you want to have like this unified strategy as a company. You can basically just take that same gateway and run it on GCP and Azure and have that unified way of managing, because the self-hosted gateway is basically just a Docker container that you can run on any infrastructure. So it can be your dev box, AKS, container apps, or anything, Kubernetes in general even. And that really allows you to use that as a way to deploy it wherever you need it. The only caveat, though, is this is a federated solution, so it needs outbound connection to Azure, which is actually one of its strengths, is you still manage everything through ARM, and basically you can then define gateway, let's say warehouse, gets to expose API ABC, but not D, and then the other gateway can expose different APIs so that you have that control depending on where they run in terms of security. So that's it in a nutshell, basically taking the managed gateway that we have in Azure, but bring it closer to where you need it.
Now, in the past, when we've had such kind of situations where we want to support on-prem or another cloud, we've used something like Azure Arc, right, as a control plane to get to it. So explain this to our listeners. How is this related to Azure Arc? Is it part of Azure Arc, or is it to be thought of something different?
Yeah, so you can, so like I mentioned, self-hosted gateway is a container image. It's available on the Microsoft Container Registry. You can just pull it down and run it on your dev box. If you go to the Azure portal, you'll actually see ways to run it. We'll give you guidance on how to deploy it with Docker, deploy it to Kubernetes through YAML, and also deploy it through Kubernetes with Helm. So we have an open source Helm chart actually where we accept contributions and that we also maintain. And then of course there is Azure Arc. Azure Arc is our fourth deployment mechanism, let's say, which is available in preview today, and basically allows you to say, I have this on-prem cluster here, which is Arc enabled. I can just install the API management extension, just point us to the API management instance that you want, how you want it to get configured, and we'll deploy it on your cluster for you. So if you want to use our OpenTelemetry metrics with Dapper, etc., just tell us and we will make it so. So it's really a way to simplify the deployment so that you don't have to worry about how it needs to run. So that's a very good question there, yes. But it is still in preview, so please give it a go. Let us know what you think. And yeah, we can make it better.
Now, with the APIM, I know there's all these policies that apparently you can set up with APIM, and should we be thinking about them completely in parity, irrespective of where you run it, or are there some considerations to say, oh, this is going to be running, on-prem, so I can't use each and every, because I'm sure there are a lot of policies that are closely tied to Azure, and then this is running in some box somewhere else. So what are some of the caveats to this?
Yeah, so actually we have three types of gateways. So we have the managed gateway, which is the most used one, which is a single tenant dedicated to you. And then we also have consumptions queue, which is pay as you go, also cloud-based. And then we have self-hosted. So these three gateways have some caveats indeed. not only on policies, but also on certain features, etc., because they are built differently. So we have a nice documentation page that compares them, which we can add to the show notes. In terms of policies, I think the majority is supported, but because the self-hosted gateway has like a separate release cycle, it can be that some of them are not in the new self-hosted gateway, or yeah, that you'll have to wait a little bit longer, or it's actually the opposite way. Self-hosted gateway allows you to use the Dapper policies, but you cannot use the Dapper policies in the cloud. So that's one of the differences, for example.
So, Tom, you mentioned something about release cycles, and some of my brain is just wondering. I believe with Azure Arc, you can kind of opt into some kind of like, hey, whenever there's a new updated version of a given, extension or whatever. What does that look like when you're running the self-hosted gateway? Like, what's the support model? Is it completely up to the customer from a high availability perspective? Is it up to them to kind of configure that? And then in terms of updates, right, is it just as simple as like, hey, take an updated Helm chart, and how would they even know? New versions are available essentially.
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and that's actually a good time to talk about the self-hosted gateway v2. So we released the v2 in GA this year, which actually allows you to have less infrastructure requirements. Because when you run the self-hosted gateway, there's criteria your infrastructure needs to meet. For example, needs to have access to Azure storage if you use a certain feature, needs to connect to the configuration API, etc. So that is reduced in V2. Again, we have documentation on what is required, but it's mainly networking. And because you run it, it's also your responsibility to make sure that it's deployed properly, it's secured properly, it's scaling, etc., etc. Now, in terms of the version, that's a good point there. So we basically support any version 2 gateway that you're running today. But in September, we announced the deprecation of V0 and V1. So customers have 1 year to migrate away, but regardless of the 2.x version, you're good to go. We know it's not that straightforward to keep up to date with them. So we started announcing the new image versions on GitHub, so you can subscribe to releases, and also for the Helm chart. So if you release a new image, we'll also automatically release a new version of Helm. And once Arc is GA, same thing there. So if you've enabled auto upgrade of minor versions on Arc, customers will also stay on the latest and greatest. So good question there.
So, running, I know this is just a Docker container, right? I can run it anywhere. That's the promise. But I know that APIM is a complex piece of software, right? And it also is quite CPU intensive, I believe, because it's kind of doing this in-flight inspection of all these packets coming in and whatnot. We have to give the customer some sort of recommendation on what sort of host they should be running it in, what kind of performance numbers we expect. Otherwise, you're saying you run it on a laptop or a normal server or something like that. It may not be enough, right? They're going to shoot themselves in the foot very quickly.
Yeah.
So is that something that is also published in the docs?
Yeah, so we have production guidance, but it is tailored to Kubernetes because we think that's the best way to deploy it. And there's a wide range of things, such as how do you schedule the gateway to be highly available? How do you make sure it is configured properly, etc. Also, how can you auto scale it? What we don't do, however, is give recommendations on the required CPU and memory, because we've noticed that this is very infrastructure specific and also workload specific. So our guidance is really do load tests, measure how the gateway is responding to your load, and then schedule accordingly. Also, some people might prefer to have a lot of instances with lower resource boundaries rather than deploying like a very few amount of instances with very big resources assigned. So Azure load testing is a very good tool there to basically assess your workloads and then operate them so that also when your production is under load, you already know how to gain insights on that. And that's also why we have open telemetry metrics, for example, to see the request per second. Yeah.
Okay, so something popped up as I'm thinking about this this architectural configuration, and I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this. So I'm a customer. I'm running self-hosted gateway in my local Kubernetes cluster, and something happens and I accidentally block like the outbound port, or I lose connectivity to Azure for whatever reason. Maybe I lose, like, I don't know, maybe the internet goes out on in my data center, who knows? But I'm curious, like what does happen, right, when it loses connectivity to the centrally located managed API gateway?
Yeah, so we're a federated solution, meaning all the configuration changes are basically pulled by the gateway. However, that does not mean you need to be live all the time. So it's basically keeping things in memory. You can also configure the local backup. So if you lose connectivity for 5 minutes, an hour, one day, 1 week, maybe even a month, it will still serve your traffic locally. Your hot path will not be impacted. The only risk that you have is that you will not get the latest configuration. So maybe on-prem things are still running different policies or whatever, which can be acceptable. But it's not going to impact your live traffic there. And also in the Azure portal, you can see how many connected instances there are, which give you an idea on that. So you won't be impacted, but you'll just miss the latest and greatest. Yeah.
So does the same, just to make sure I understand, all of the changes, are they still made on this central API management, and then
Yes.
they just get synced to the local? There's no like, I just want to change the local implementation. It's all coming from the parent. Like there's no,
Yeah.
like, each child doesn't have its own autonomy to like change
No,
its shape.
today
Okay.
that's not the
Okay.
case. No, we didn't have a lot of requests
Okay.
to do that. So it's not that you could let's say, add an API to a given gateway by adding a Kubernetes resource or anything. No, it's
Okay.
fully managed through ARM still, so that we have the same RBAC experience there as well.
Okay. Makes sense.
And if I were a developer that's wants to try out this this new experience, like I said, you can run the container on my laptop. I have a laptop here. You can run the container. Now, from a developer experience, I still have to go to the Azure portal to do the setting up of the policies and the rules and
Yes.
whatnot. And the moment I hit submit, it basically gets pushed back down to my instance running on the laptop and is active immediately. Is that how we think about it?
Yeah, that's correct. And it's available in premium and also dev SKU, so that if you are in your dev test scenario, you can just use your existing dev SKU, and you can basically create as many gateway resources as you want. So imagine you have 4 developers. If they want, they could have their own gateway configuration so that they don't influence each other. However, the gateway resource is also the billing unit. So for every resource that you create, you'll be charged $1,000 a month. So that's how we bill it. It's not that you need a special SKU or anything, but if you run 1 million instances, for example, you'll still be billed that same amount, not per instance. So at first sight, that can sound very expensive, but in production, if you would need to pay for the amount of instances, that's going to be a ridiculous cost. And that's why we have this model.
Yeah, and good to hear that, because that was one of my pet peeves earlier on about APM. It was just way too expensive even to kick the tires.
Yes. So we made it available in DevSKU so that everybody can give it a try. So yeah.
So Tom, this is more from an architecture perspective and like use cases for self-hosted gateway. So I know we talked about, if you have local clusters running or, you want to run on a Docker container and host it closer to potentially other callers. Like I understand that conceptually, but I am curious, when you have it in this containerized form, do you see customers who are like having it play intermediary between microservices? Like they'll call the API, like they'll call basically the API management gateway locally, it'll flow to another microservice. Like, does it play intermediary between like services that are communicating with each other maybe within a cluster, or is it really more for client communication that's bound for like a backend service? And then, apps would still communicate similarly like they do today in Kubernetes, where it's just, potentially a direct.
Yeah. So to rephrase your question.
Yeah, maybe that wasn't the most eloquent
No,
way
no,
of
no, no,
asking.
no. No, I'll just put it differently.
Okay.
The question is, do you see people use it as, let's call it ingress, meaning external traffic flowing inside of your application versus also from your internal service A to B
Yeah. Service to
as
service.
like the central hub, let's say. And I would say that that's a very underrated pattern that before I joined, I used that a lot. So for me, API management is the central place for all API traffic, meaning externally and internally, because you have the same needs for that traffic. Like if you have team A and B using each other's servers, you still want to have that deep coupling. You want to have the policies, the authorization model, etc. And I think that's a very good thing to have as well. Because if team A gets breached, you can simply revoke their whole subscription, API subscription or whatever, so that basically you just throw them out. And another reason is the policies. They're like the gold mine for API builders. You don't have to implement things yourself. And something I had at a customer was we had a lot of load on the production APIs, and we noticed that it was a partner that was doing it. We basically said, hey, if you don't back off, we will make sure you back off. And surprise, they didn't do it. So what we did was we literally applied a rate limit policy, and after a couple of seconds, our whole production system was back up and running because the policy. So if you don't have that for your internal teams as well, you could have big problems there because you couldn't manage the traffic. So I always advise if you're external or internal team, always go over API management. So that's also why I created a sample for Azure Container Apps that does exactly that. So it deploys a container app with a self-hosted gateway so that container app to container app communication can go over the API gateway without going outside of the container environment.
Yeah, that's actually really cool. I'll have to take a look at that because I certainly can see why that would be valuable. So yeah, thanks for doing.
So you mentioned this is V2 that you're just kind of working on. Like, what is there? Do you already have plans for something upcoming, like a next version or other features that you're thinking about?
If you know me, then I have a lot of ideas. But my main focus is mainly to make it simpler to deploy the self-hosted gateway. So that's why I also created a sample for container apps to show that maybe you want to have a simpler way of deploying it without Kubernetes, for example. That's why we have a Helm chart so that you don't have to fiddle around with the YAML, and also Arc, which is an easy way to deploy outside of Azure, because we see a lot of growth in terms of customers deploying to AWS, GCP, etc., because of that multi-cloud strategy. So I want to make it simpler for customers so that they don't actually have to know how to configure the gateway, which also makes sure that they have less frustration there. So I would say that that's my current mission at this point in time. Yeah.
So I'm curious on a couple of things. So one would be, I'm a customer, I have an issue with my self-hosted gateway. It's not necessarily supported, but it does depend on some of these upstream packages, Helm charts. Do you have an open source GitHub profile where people can file bugs and issues that they or recommended new features, those kind of things?
Yeah, so the Helm chart is open source, which is also the home for the self-hosted gateway. They can file bugs there, but if you have like production problems, Azure support is there, and then you end up with me if it's serious enough. But we have that central open source place, and we actively review the either bugs or feature requests, and also acceptable requests. So lately we've had some contributions there that help everybody actually. So that's really nice to have people contributing back to it as well. Yeah.
Awesome. This has been great, Tom. Thank you so much for sharing this new exciting feature of APIM. I think it's got a lot of opportunity. Like I know a lot of my customers, especially I'm in the financial services space. They don't necessarily rush to the cloud just yet, and this is something they would really appreciate, having that flexibility, just having the control plane in Azure at the same time having that connectivity internally within their own data center. So
yeah, that's actually a good point as well, because it's not because you have API management that you have to use the managed gateway. If you're like fully on-prem still, you could already use API management purely with the self-hosted gateway as a stepping stone to go to the cloud, basically. So that's also possible. Yeah.
Well, I think before we go, KEDA wants to say hello. He just woke up, so
hey.
Yes, he is excited about the self-hosted gateway. He just told me. He was like, "Wow, V1 was good, but V2, sign me up."
Woohoo! All right. Well,
Oh wait,
thanks,
last
Tom.
question,
Oh, yeah.
Tom.
Yeah.
Resources. Like I'm assuming you have some documentation, but it sounds like you have some great samples out there. I know you put together a lot of stuff. Is there a good blog post, stuff like that you think you can send over to us, so that people can play around with some of this coolness that you put together?
Yeah, so I'll add some show notes there with all the documentation samples, and I think we also have a blog post coming up that walks through what's new in V2, how you can migrate, and also if you're using V0 or V1, there is an Azure Advisor recommendation to migrate those tenants that also gives you that guidance. So if you don't see the recommendation, you don't have to worry. You're good to go.
Cool.
Thank you for
Thanks,
having me.
Thank you, Tom.
Have a good one.